Hey, I'm Laz and I'm a professional fashion and commercial photographer and filmmaker based in Australia. I want to share behind the scenes, my thoughts and tips and tricks on how to level up your work. In this video, we're going to cover behind the scenes a fashion editorial I actually shot recently right in this very studio. I'm going to cover off the gear list, the reasons why we chose continuous lighting instead of using strobe lighting for the photography, what video equipment we used and why, and also just some tips and tricks as to how we set up the space to help maximize our time. I decided to use continuous lighting for this particular campaign, mainly because we needed to be able to shoot video at the same time. In order for me to not have to change setups all the time, I chose to use continuous lighting, which I had to test first, because obviously when you're trying to work in an ambient space like this where we can't control the light, I couldn't shut curtains and make it completely black. I needed to know that I could shoot at the settings I wanted to shoot at, which I'll cover later on, and still get the look that I wanted, both for photo and video, because it's really important. I guess I'll cover off the gear that I use first. So I shot on a Fuji GFX100s, which is a medium format digital camera. I recently switched from Canon and Sony for photo and video to completely Fujifilm, except for the red that I'm now shooting this on as well. So I chose that camera because it's a studio shoot. The lighting was very controlled. It's not a fast-paced shoot, so I didn't need crazy autofocus, crazy speed. But because of the lighting setup, I needed to have quite good control over the image in post-production. I needed to be able to control the highlights and the shadows and know that I am not lighting it perfectly, but I can control that in post. So that's the reason why I chose the GFX100s. I also own a Fuji X-H2, which is an APS-C flagship camera from Fuji. The reason I didn't shoot on that is because the low light performance isn't as good, and it was too much of a risk to actually shoot with that, not being able to keep the detail that I needed to for that particular brand that wanted it shot. Going with video, I actually shot on the red purely for the same reasons as great raw output from the camera. I could control the colors and match it to the photos that I was shooting. There's numerous reasons why I shoot on red, but to me, red suits Fujifilm as far as the colors go. So it's the closest, so I can match it in post really easily. So it suits my workflow. I used to shoot with Sony and the colors are just so different that obviously if you're shooting raw, it doesn't matter. But to me, it's just the easiest. If I know that they're in the same ballpark, I can then get them to the same look in post. So that's the reason why I chose the red. And I shot on the Sigma 18-35 EF, which is currently being used to shoot me now. Really versatile zoom length for that particular camera. It's kind of perfect. It goes down to 1.8, which is a really wide aperture, so great for low light. And it's just a really good workhorse. To be honest, I barely ever take the lens off my camera. So they're the pieces of kit that we used. On the lighting side, generally I use Profoto gear. So in a shoot like this, I would generally use a couple of Profoto D2 1000 watt strobes with a bunch of modifiers. My go-to is actually this white umbrella, extra large umbrella you can see behind me, I'm using as a hair light, which usually gives a very beautiful diffused look. Obviously I couldn't use this because of the reasons I kind of mentioned earlier. So we instead went with an Aperture 600D, which is a 600 watt continuous light. We used a softbox so I can control the direction of the light, which is really important because the background we wanted to create depth in. I actually used a really cheap Light Pro 120 watt other light just to kind of create depth. Give me more options as far as shaping light, adding things to the scene. I also have an Aperture 300D Mark II, which we used as well. So we ended up having 3 continuous lights, and then I used a range of bouncers. We used flags, which kind of just enabled us to set up the look that we wanted, have it all set up and control the different light sources. As you can see, we used one for a hair light, one for the key light, which was the biggest light source. We had a side fill with 300D as well, and it all comes into play and comes together to create a certain look that we wanted to create. So the 600D we used as the key light. Obviously, the key light needs to be the strongest light in a general rule. because that's what you use to light the subject. The particular lighting modifier we used was a big dome with a grid on the front of it, and that was to control the spill so that we didn't light the whole background, because a lot of the time people think, oh, I'm just going to shine a light at the subject, and yeah, that's great, except then all of a sudden the background is way too hot and you have a problem with controlling the depth and the way that you want the image to look. So for me, I decided to use a gridded softbox to get that look that I wanted. Needed to be big enough to cast enough light on the subject, but also directional enough to not have unwanted spill. The second light I set up was a hair light, which was just to kind of give a bit of shape to kind of like what this light is doing now. Otherwise I look really flat against the background. I used the 120 watt light for this, and I had to end up flagging it because it was actually spilling on the model. And so you don't want contamination. So not only did I have to, because it was kind of coming from kind of camera top left, I had to then use a black flag on the other side to remove any unwanted spill on the shadow side, just to make sure that we had good contrast still. So the whole time I'm mindful of every time I add a light, that what is that doing to my overall image, and what do I need to do to really keep that light source as pure as possible as to what it needs to do in the scene. So yeah, there was a couple of things. I had to flag it off to make sure that it wasn't hitting the same light that my key light was creating. And then obviously I had to make sure that it wasn't creating other bounce light because I was shooting across the scene. So that's what I did with that particular light. Third light was the 300D. And I think I actually used I'm trying to remember now, but a beauty dish on the front of it to create another kind of side fill, I guess, from my perspective, because it was quite shadowy because of the direction of the softbox that I'd set up. I needed to really make sure that I needed to remove the harshness of contrast on the subject, because obviously there's a balance between it looking really moody and cool, but you know, in a fashion campaign, the stuff needs to be really clear. So, you know, the scene needs to be coherent. There needs to be no really dark spots. So I felt the need for lighting that side, and that felt to me like we'd completed the picture. So those three lights, as you can see, we've taken some footage with them completely off, slowly turning each one on and seeing what they do to the scene. And hopefully that kind of paints a really good picture as to what we did and why, and what look we were trying to create. The last thing I want to touch on is I've got a big Avenger 8x8 scrim. It's a large quarter of a stop of diffusion material over a 8x8 foot frame that's mounted on a 45-degree angle, and it's quite high. So to my right, there's a bunch of open glass and windows that during the day I get a lot of natural light in, which is amazing for certain applications like photography and different things. But when you're lighting a scene like this, you don't want that contaminating your scene, because these lights are all balanced to different color temperatures, and natural light changes. If a cloud comes over, it changes the color temperature. So what you don't want is contamination. So obviously an ideal scenario is having no external light in the scene. I can't do that here. So I did the best efforts, which was just trying to diffuse as much as possible. So I used that to soften any direct light that could have potentially hit the scene. And that just gave me a little bit more leeway, knowing that I can run the lights a bit hotter. So obviously I'm trying to expose the scene as dark as possible without the lights. So that's another consideration. My starting point was quite dark, and then I added in the lights as I went to make sure that that ambient light was contaminating as least as possible as we went and built the scene. So I've already touched on the camera that I chose to use for this shoot, but one really important aspect I didn't really talk about is the amount of light I needed to do what I needed to do. Shutter speed, when you're talking about a video camera, as a general rule, you either have shutter angle or shutter speed. And as a general rule, you want it to be twice your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 25 frames a second, my shutter speed should be 1/50. But if you set your shutter angle to 180 degrees, that generally automatically does that for you. For photography, shooting with continuous light, there's a couple of things. To freeze action, your shutter speed needs to be at least double your focal length. So this is a bit weird, but I had to think about, okay, if I'm going to be shooting at, you know, maybe 50 mil, my shutter speed needs to be at least 100, if not more. So to be safe, it's probably 1/250. And then I need to think about what ISO I can shoot at. So with the GFX, the reason it's so great is because with a large medium format sensor like that, it is great at low light. I can use it at really high ISO settings and it doesn't create a lot of noise. It's actually really clean. So for me, I was able to shoot at quite a high ISO. I think I touched on 3200 ISO, and it didn't introduce any unwanted noise. Whereas with even Canon full frame cameras, I wouldn't have been able to shoot at that ISO without introducing a really muddy aspect. It just wouldn't have been ideal. So the compromise for me was I knew because of the gear I had that I could shoot with continuous lighting, knowing that it's not completely ideal, but knowing that I can run a higher ISO with the camera that I had, still getting a clean image with the shutter speed as high as it needed to be able to still freeze and not be blurry and come out a bit weird. So that's just something I wanted to touch on because it's probably really important that not many people do think about when they're thinking about their lighting situation. So one other point on the whole camera selection ISO conversation, I guess one thing I didn't really talk about previously was the fact that it's really important to do the maths backwards. So for me, I knew that I wanted to shoot at around f8, which is my aperture setting. Generally, I don't want a really shallow depth of field. So if I'm shooting at say f4 on a medium format camera, the depth of field for my focus is actually a lot shallower than a full frame camera. So, if I'm shooting a fashion campaign, I don't want the subject's eyes to be in focus and the clothes be blurry. Most e-commerce shoots are generally shot at f8, which means that everything is in focus, and that's on purpose. So for me, I needed to be able to go, okay, I've got enough light at f8 to be able to expose this person properly. So that all factored in. So I knew, well, if I need to shoot at f8, my shutter speed needs to be, say, around 160 to 200, which is probably as low as you can get away with when you've got a moving subject. That's why I then had to look at ISO, because obviously in the golden trilogy of photography world, you've got aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. ISO is a software kind of setting to help you expose things correctly. And you should always try and shoot at base ISO of your camera to get the cleanest image, but also knowing your gear enables you to make other choices based on other things you can't control, such as your aperture and your shutter speed if they need to be fixed. And I knew then, okay, I need to shoot at 1600 to 3200 ISO. I can't use my APS-C camera because it just doesn't have the performance there, and I'll be doing crap loads of denoising and whatever else post-production, and it's going to be scary and I can't guarantee the outcome. So I just wanted to kind of clarify why I made that particular decision and why it's important to know the performance of your camera, and especially your ISO kind of noise limits. Probably you need to know the limits of your own nose as well if you're taking photos with the camera up against your face. But noise limits, really help you make the right decision when it comes to selecting your gear for the shoot that you're doing. So to leave no stone unturned, I'll address the whole handheld versus tripod scenario. For this particular shoot, the video was all shot on a locked off tripod because we wanted to have a particular look where the scene was in frame, model walked in, did the similar kind of movements and then walked out of scene. So that was kind of a pre-planned production decision. As far as I go with my fashion work, I'm drawn to a lot of movements. Even with my video work, generally, I do a lot of handheld filming. And same with photo, I find that, even if you're in the same scene, changing angles can really change the way something feels. Shooting really low makes the model look really tall. So there's different decisions. When you're shooting with a chair, there's particular angles that look better or worse. So as I'm kind of showing you certain shots from behind the scenes, as this video plays on, you'll kind of see that, it is important to have the freedom to move around, especially when you're in a kind of limited scene, to be able to create small variances in the look and feel to make the campaign still feel cohesive, but like fresh, and not every look is the same. So, for e-commerce, I can completely understand using a tripod, having it set off and then remotely triggering it or sitting at the computer. And so you got ease of post-production, cropping and all that kind of stuff. But any campaign work, I'm always shooting handheld. I'm always moving around. You know, the more nimble you are and the more you're able to know what angles do what, that's an awesome tool to have in your arsenal as well, so that you can make creative choices on the day and during the shoot to get the look and feel that you want as well. One final point about the gear selection, I didn't really talk about what lens I used on my GFX 100s. I use 99% of the time the 45 to 100, which is equivalent to 35 to 80 mil full frame focal length. So as a fashion photographer, that kind of 24 to 70 realm is kind of the bread and butter. Like 99% of the time you are using those focal lengths. A lot of the time I'm only shooting wider when I'm trying to get a particular look, generally when I'm trying to get the model to look really tall, kind of, you know, a bit of distorted vibes, or, you know, even kind of coming over the top and shooting really wide, it can give a different perspective. As a general rule, I kind of hang around that 50 mil kind of mark, just purely because it's the closest to the human eye. It's really flattering. It's what people expect to see. And at the longer end, the 80 mil, you know, you get a really flattering kind of compressed look. But if you're always shooting that and always shooting wide open, it's just the same. So, you know, you need to be able to move around and create different looks and feels. So for me, shooting with a zoom as a fashion photographer, it means I don't have to choose to change lenses every 5 minutes as well. I more often than not choose a zoom lens with a good kind of wide aperture. You know, the Canon world, I'm shooting on a 24 to 7 2.8 constant. Here I actually shoot with an f4 45 to 100 because that's the lowest it goes with the GFX line, unless you go into primes. But yeah, once again, it's just about ease of use, versatility. For me, that's the choice I make. It's always kind of making sure that I give myself the most leeway to be creative within the realms of what I'm doing, as opposed to locking myself into particular things by the gear choice I make. The final thing that I want to touch on is shooting tethered versus shooting to the camera. For most studio settings, I'm always shooting tethered, and it's purely so that I know that the client can review the work as we go. It makes my job easier for post-production because often I'll get them to do selections as we go as well. They're happy, they know that the shots that they want have been gotten, especially if they have a particular shot list that we're working towards. I can show them the grade as we go. I can build it so that, you know, once I get into the editing room, everything's kind of 80% there. So then it's about cropping, exposure, finalizing that look. But, you know, because I've shot to Capture One live with the client, I've gotten that feedback straight away, which is really hard to get kind of over the internet, over email. A lot of things can be lost in translation. So for me, even on location these days, I'm often, if it's a campaign, I'm often shooting with an assistant or a digi, which is a digital assistant, but you know, they're often there monitoring the shots. It's there in Capture One. We can see the end result to a large degree with a filter that we're going to use or whatever it may be. And we can make sure that we're really in the ballpark so that we're not missing anything. And it's just that extra level of safety when you're starting to do bigger campaign shoots. That's kind of what's expected at this level. So that's the reason. Sometimes I do shoot to card. I'm very confident with my equipment that I'm not gonna stuff a shot up too badly. But once again, there's no real reason to it unless I'm shooting at the beach and it just doesn't make sense to bring all the gear. That's the only reason why I shoot just to the card and not tethered, is if it's, you know, it's a portable situation, you've got to run and gun really quickly, then I just have to fall back on the fact that I know my gear well enough. I'm looking at the histograms when I'm shooting, I'm making sure I'm not overexposing shots and just trusting that I'm going to be able to come back and do the job. But, you know, shooting tethered, once you start, then it's really hard to go back to that because it's just that you can see it as you're doing it. So that's the reason why I shoot tethered the majority of the time now. All right, so just to recap, went over a few things. Gear choices, you know, camera, lenses, cinema camera, all that kind of stuff. Lighting decisions and choices with the gear, shooting tethered, not shooting tethered, all the other considerations. I just wanted to share this with you in, you know, one kind of giant video, just so that you could understand beginning to end what an editorial photo shoot looks like, the reasons, how it all comes together, why people make certain decisions to do certain things. In the future, I've done other shoots as well that I'll be happy to share in different contexts, shooting with different gear, I'll happily explain that. Also dive into things like software choices, why I shoot Capture One and not Lightroom, you know, why does my workflow lean towards that way, as well as different things as well. So talking about the creative side as well, you know, what is important, what's not important, does gear really level you up or does it not, you know? And I'll do some important comparisons. So as I mentioned, I have quite a gamut of gear. You know, I shoot on everything from a Red cinema camera to the Fuji gear, and it's all, you know, not full frame, and it's medium format, and it's this and that. And, you know, I've used a lot of different vendors now, and I've come to a set of gear that I really like and I get good results out of. But I think a lot of the things that go into creating the work that I do aren't actually very tangible. It's not related to gear at all. It's actually the things that make me do the things I do, and the creative freedoms that are kind of brought to the surface by the gear that I use in the inspiration. So I'll definitely be sharing that with you as well. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I hope you've learned something. I hope that it's really solidified, even if you got a great tip on, hey, why would I use a gridded softbox? You know, and if that's the only tip, then I'm really happy that I was able to share that with you. But, you know, hopefully we can build this channel to a good repository of knowledge around photography and filmmaking, that someone who's working in the industry, that's shooting almost every day. I do a lot of agency work, I do a lot of brand shoots, I do a lot of commercial work as well. I just shot album cover for an Australian artist here. So I'd love to share all that kind of experiences with you as well, and just kind of share behind the scenes with you. And you can come along on the journey with me as I grow as a creator as well. So yeah, see you next time.